Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror TV series named To the Lake, aka Epidemiya Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins in an office building where employees work with masks on, not engaging in conversation with one another as if wary of something. An office lady named Irina, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere, heads to the restroom to dump her wastewater. Suddenly, she hears a strange noise from a stall. Upon opening the door, she discovers a girl with pale, lifeless eyes slumped over the stinky toilet. Sensing danger, Irina quickly grabs her belongings and races out of the office. Irina is recently divorced and struggling to make it in Moscow with her son Anton. Earlier that day in the park, she encountered a person with similar symptoms, a pale-eyed, coughing stranger. Irina recognizes this as a contagious disease and swiftly takes Anton away from the scene. Soon, news of an unknown virus outbreak in Moscow spreads through television and the internet. The virus rapidly infects the lungs, causing symptoms such as coughing and pale eyes, and kills its victims within 4 days. The transmission rate is alarmingly fast, with 2,000 confirmed cases so far. Several areas have been quarantined by the military, and agitated crowds take to the streets in protest. Witnessing 2 infected individuals in just 1 day, Irina grasps the severity of the situation. Before her shift ends, she rushes to her son's school, hoping to take him home quickly. To her dismay, the school has already been quarantined by the military, with no one allowed in or out. It turns out that a student with the infectious disease was found there earlier. The school initially believed isolating the infected student and their classmates would suffice, but the military later issued a new order to lock down the entire school. The infected student, huddled in the corner with bloodshot eyes, is taken away by soldiers in protective gear. They spray a white powder on the girl, disregarding her distraught parents' furious but chicken-like screams. Irina witnesses the ordeal, realizing the situation is even more dire than she had imagined. She immediately calls Anton, relieved to find that he managed to avoid being quarantined in the gym and is hiding in the changing room. Irina instructs him to meet her in the school's backyard cafeteria, but no one expects the cafeteria doors and windows to be locked. Anxious to save her son, Irina tells Anton to stand back before picking up a rock and smashing a window. Meanwhile, on the main road outside Moscow, vehicles are stopped by soldiers who announce that the city is under lockdown. No one is allowed in or out except for supply vehicles. The crowd expresses dissatisfaction, but the soldiers remain unmoved, explaining that a terrifying virus has broken out in Moscow, and the military has no choice but to resort to such measures. Among the anxious crowd is a man named Sergei, Irina's ex-husband. He had planned to pick up Anton and take him to his countryside villa for a visit, but now can't even enter the city. However, he has yet to comprehend the horror of the pandemic. Realizing the situation is hopeless, he reluctantly returns home. Later at night, Sergei fell asleep like a pig, but was soon awakened by the bright flashlight beam coming from outside. He cautiously went downstairs to investigate. Fortunately, it wasn't an intruder, but his father, Boris. As a former military researcher, Boris possessed deep knowledge about the ongoing virus outbreak. With 3 million people in Moscow, riots would be inevitable if the virus couldn't be contained and continued to spread. The villa Sergei lived in was just a few dozen kilometers away from Moscow and would definitely be affected. They needed to leave as soon as possible. Knowing his father's expertise, Sergei agreed to rest for the night and set off early the next morning. However, before leaving, he wanted to find a way to get his son Anton and ex-wife Irina out of the city. As he left, Sergei told his father not to wait for him if he hadn't returned by dawn. Shortly after Sergei's departure, unexpected visitors arrived at the villa. A few armed men got out of a jeep and headed towards several nearby villas. Sergei's neighbor and close friend, Leonya, was also aware of the virus outbreak and was packing to leave for the airport. However, his daughter, Polina, brought him back to reality by revealing that all airports in Moscow were closed. At that moment, the armed men entered Leonya's house. He initially thought they were government forces, but soon realized they were merely appraising his valuable furniture, with no mention of the virus. Sensing something was off, Leonya showed them a photo of himself with high-ranking military officials hoping to intimidate them. However, it didn't work, and one of the burly men knocked him out. The group then began searching the house for valuables. They were just robbers taking advantage of the chaos. One of them even took an interest in Leonya's partner, Marina, who was now pregnant, pulling out a drug to incapacitate her. Just as he was about to have his way with her, a pair of scissors plunged into the back of his neck, courtesy of Polina. The attack wasn't fatal, and the tough man quickly grabbed Polina by the throat. Fortunately, she kept her cool and seized the opportunity to kick off the wall, knocking him down. The scissors in his neck sank deeper, effectively killing him. At the same time, one of the robbers broke into Sergei's house and entered the yard. Boris, a retired soldier, showed no fear, raising his shotgun and firing without warning. The intruder was quickly taken down. The remaining robbers rushed over, but after exchanging fire for a few rounds, they realized they were outmatched and surrendered. They only wanted to take their injured companion and leave, promising not to bother Boris and his family again. Boris, after watching the robbers drive away, quickly went to Leonya's house with Sergei's current wife, Anna, and her son. The crisis had been averted, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Leonya was still reeling from the experience and couldn't stop talking about the need to leave as soon as possible. Fires raged throughout the city, casting eerie glows in the sky. Irina gazed silently into the distance, her heart filled with worry. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Peering through the peephole, Irina saw her own mother and opened the door. But upon noticing her mother's pale eyes, Irina immediately shut the door again. Anton asked why they weren't letting Grandma in, and Irina yelled at him to go back to his room. She turned on the radio, trying to drown out the cries for help outside with music. Irina knew that her mother had treated an infected patient earlier that day, and she couldn't believe how quickly the virus had spread. Allowing her mother in now would only risk infecting her and her son. After some time, the commotion outside ceased, but then the doorbell rang again. Irina rushed to check and was surprised to see her ex-husband, Sergei. After confirming he wasn't infected, she opened the door and embraced him, never expecting him to come to their rescue at this crucial time. It turns out, Sergei had gone through great lengths to get to them. He had discovered Moscow was under quarantine earlier that morning, and with his father's persuasion, decided to leave the city and find a way to take his son and ex-wife with him. Sergei had managed to sneak into the city hidden in a truck carrying food. The streets were empty, and residents were strictly forbidden from going outside. Upon reaching Irina's building, Sergei instructed the driver to wait for him, even giving him extra money. However, when he returned with Irina and the son to the truck, they found only scattered supplies and no sign of the driver. Shortly after Sergei had left, a group of violent criminals armed with various weapons had raided the truck, killing the driver. Sergei found the driver's body in the truck bed, quickly throwing it out. Just then, the criminals returned. Sergei started the truck and narrowly escaped their clutches. Meanwhile, Sergei's father and their neighbor, Leonya, were packing their belongings and loading them onto a vehicle. As they prepared to leave, Sergei's current wife, Anna, stood silently, refusing to get in the car. She was determined not to leave without Sergei. Suddenly, they heard the roar of an approaching car. Everyone went on guard, only to see that it was Sergei returning with Irina. Anna's excitement turned to shock when she noticed Irina. At that moment, Anna's son, Misha, saw several jeeps approaching menacingly. He immediately guessed the robbers were back for revenge. The group hurriedly moved their belongings, as if trying to escape something terrifying. They tensed up when they noticed another car approaching, but relaxed when they realized it was just an ordinary man. They now had to be cautious as the entire city of Moscow was under lockdown due to the terrifying virus outbreak. Although their residence was far from the city, they had inevitably fallen victim to robberies. They had managed to drive the criminals away, but nobody could guarantee they wouldn't return for revenge. The man who suddenly appeared was seeking help. His pregnant wife had suddenly started experiencing severe stomach pain, and it seemed that she was about to give birth. Anna suggested that they should bring the pregnant woman inside to rest. However, Irina assertively raised her gun, telling the desperate couple to leave immediately as this wasn't the time for compassion. Leonya agreed with Irina's decision. The man seeking help realized he couldn't change their minds, so he reluctantly drove away. Later, Sergei and Leonya's families finally prepared their supplies and hurriedly set off in 3 cars. But they didn't get far before an accident occurred. Black smoke suddenly billowed from the exhaust pipe of one of the cars. Sergei stopped to check and discovered that the diesel in the car had frozen. In their haste, they had added fuel that wasn't antifreeze. Boris suggested that they needed a tow chain to pull the car to the nearest gas station. Leonya immediately interjected, saying he had a tow chain at his house and would go back to get it. Without waiting for Sergei's agreement, he drove away with Marina and his daughter. As it turned out, Leonya had already made up his mind to ditch Sergei and his family. In fact, he had a tow chain in his car's trunk, but he had hidden it earlier. At that moment, Leonya was driving in a different direction. As they passed a wooded area, Marina needed to relieve herself, so he accompanied her into the woods, leaving Polina alone in the car. While she was bored, she saw several vehicles approaching in the distance. It turned out to be the same robbers who had previously targeted Leonya's home. Fortunately, Polina sensed danger and hid in the woods just in time to meet up with her father. The gang leader recognized the car as belonging to Leonya because he had noted the license plate number on a tablet at his house. The leader then ordered his henchmen to search the woods for them. Leonya and his family realized they were in trouble and hurried deeper into the woods, eventually hiding under a cliff. The robbers soon followed their footprints but stopped their pursuit due to freezing conditions. However, the leader insisted on continuing the search, angering the thugs. One of them shot the leader, who fell onto the cliff facing Leonya's family, terrifying them into silence. The rest of the robbers left without lingering and took Leonya's car parked on the side of the road. Meanwhile, Sergei's family was still waiting for news from Leonya. After such a long delay, they began to suspect something was wrong. Suddenly, a distress call from Leonya came through their walkie-talkie. When Sergei saw the Leonya family, he guessed they had planned to abandon them, as this wasn't the way back to their house. However, he couldn't bear to leave his friends stranded in the wilderness and decided to take them to a nearby gas station before parting ways. At this point, Boris managed to get the car to run temporarily by pouring hot water on it. The two families quickly arrived at the gas station. There were more people at the gas station than they had anticipated, and all the fuel types were sold out. As per their agreement, Leonya's family had to get out of the car and find their own way. In the crowd, Leonya asked passers-by if they could hitch a ride, even offering a significant amount of money, but no one paid him any mind. Just then, a woman pointed at a pale-faced man wearing glasses and shouted that he was infected and needed to leave immediately. The man tried to argue, but was suddenly stabbed and collapsed unconscious. The onlookers became even more convinced that he was an infected person and scattered in panic. In no time, the once bustling gas station was left with only Leonya's family, standing helplessly in the wind. Sergei had initially been reluctant to leave Leonya's family behind, but upon witnessing the chaos, he couldn't afford to wait any longer. He immediately drove away on his own. Leonya's daughter, Polina, spotted a car not far away and wondered if they could use it. However, Leonya immediately stopped her, suspecting the car belonged to a fallen infected person. Using it would put them at risk of infection. Luckily, Leonya noticed that the gas station attendant was still in the room. He rushed over and handed a large sum of money to the attendant, who finally agreed to shelter them for one night. The attendant was foresighted, having stored a large amount of supplies and fuel. But he didn't seem like a good person, constantly staring at Polina with shining eyes and even inviting her to drink with him. Leonya quickly intervened. This angered the attendant, who took out a gun from his drawer and forced Leonya's family out again. Fortunately, he didn't shoot, and they returned to the cold night. As Leonya's partner Marina cried in frustration, Sergei's family unexpectedly returned in their car. They couldn't bear to abandon their friends, and Boris agreed that leaving them behind was wrong. So Sergei decided to follow his heart and rescue Leonya's family. Leonya was moved by their return, but didn't forget about the hostile attendant. The scene shifted to Sergei confronting the attendant, grabbing his arm while talking. Then, Leonya charged in with a gun, and the poor attendant was quickly subdued. This meant that all the supplies and fuel inside now belonged to them. Misha then confirmed that the fallen person's eyes weren't white, meaning he wasn't infected, and his car could be used. Both families quickly loaded up the car with supplies and fuel, embarking on their escape journey once more. Their destination was the Lake Vongaziro, 1,000 kilometers away, where a cabin on a small island in the middle of the lake awaited them. Boris vacationed there every year, and the remote location with plentiful resources made it an ideal refuge during the apocalypse. As they were driving on the escape route, they discovered a fire truck blocking the road ahead, with several gruesome corpses lying nearby. It seemed a firefight had just taken place. After searching and finding no survivors, they decided to move the fire truck and continue on their way. They discarded the driver's corpse, and Sergei took the driver's seat, managing to move the fire truck to the roadside. Just as they were about to leave, they discovered an injured person lying in the back seat of the fire truck. Sergei approached to examine the person, who suddenly attacked him with a knife. Sergei was injured, and his condition worsened, even causing hallucinations. His family rushed to his side, quickly lifted him into the car, and continued driving. Fortunately, they soon found a few uninhabited houses ahead. They carried Sergei into one of the houses, where his ex-wife Irina skillfully stitched up his wound. The needle and thread had been found by his current wife, Anna, in the neighboring house. Boris was anxious, knowing that stitching the wound was only the first step, and the lack of proper medical supplies posed a constant threat to Sergei's life. Sergei soon developed a high fever and became delirious. Anna continued to care for him, but she was shocked to discover that he was dreaming about Irina, even calling her name in his sleep. This devastated Anna, but things soon took a turn. Leonya found an old woman nearby who was a veterinarian, but could confidently treat humans as well. She gave Sergei a shot of antibiotics, took the car Leonya had given her, and fled for her shitty life without concern for Sergei's fate. However, the shot worked wonders, and Sergei's condition improved significantly by the next morning. Just when they thought they were safe, a new crisis emerged. Misha was attacked and knocked unconscious while fetching firewood outside, and all the food in the car was stolen. They deduced that the culprit was the young man who had given them the needle and thread. Leonya led Boris and Anna to the man's residence, where they broke in without knocking. The young man was startled and ran towards a room, carrying a fainting little girl. They then were shocked to witness that several infected individuals were eating the stolen food. These people were likely the young man's family. One of the infected women charged at Leonya and the others with an axe, forcing them to shoot her down in self-defense. After killing the infected woman, Sergei's family had no choice but to leave. On the road, they happened upon a man named Pavel, who was revealed to be a doctor. He not only treated Sergei's wounds, but also gave his son Anton a bag of candy. Seeing Pavel's broken glasses, Irina gave him one of her contact lenses out of gratitude, and even helped him put it on. Hormone sparks flew between them, but their paths were not aligned. Irina was heading to a refuge 1,000 kilometers away, while Pavel was going to a town in the opposite direction to deliver medicine to his patients. He was truly a good man, risking his life to find medicine in an abandoned hospital filled with dead patients and criminals hiding within. His glasses were shattered during the search. After parting with Pavel, Sergei's group pressed on, not expecting to find a bridge impassable due to its severed structure, and it looked like it had been deliberately damaged. The group stood at the broken bridge, realizing they must return and take another route. However, it was this very broken bridge that led them to turn back and once again encounter Pavel, who was being robbed by villagers for supplies. It turns out, after the virus outbreak, these villagers were left with scarce resources and soon became the first abandoned by the government. In order to survive, they blocked the road, robbing passing vehicles of their supplies. They even targeted local hospital ambulances, showing no mercy when met with resistance. Seeing that, Irina decided to help him, leaping out of the car and charging the crowd with her gun, single-handedly driving away the road bandits. In the chaos, no one noticed that Anton, who had been sitting alone in the car, was being watched by a stranger. Fortunately, the boy was alert and quickly jumped out of the car, running towards the woods. By this time, Pavel was bloodied, and Irina had to drag his muscular body back to the car. Fearing retaliation from the villagers, the group hurriedly drove off. However, Anton emerged from the woods, finding that his family had vanished. He called out anxiously, but there was no answer. The sensible Anton didn't cry, but instead embarked on a journey to find his mother with determination. Luckily, he soon arrived in a nearby town, but it was deserted like a ghost town. Anton became terrified. After wandering around, he finally spotted a few living people, but their actions frightened him even more. He turned and ran, and a soldier immediately chased after him. Anton stumbled into a hospital, hiding under a bed and trying to quiet his breathing. However, the soldier persistently followed, discovering Anton's hiding place. The soldier ordered him to lie down, raising his gun to pull the trigger. Just then, a figure appeared out of nowhere, knocking the soldier to the ground. It turns out to be a doctor who had originally planned to return for some medicine. Upon learning that Anton had been separated from his family, she decided to take the boy and leave the hospital first. Otherwise, Anton would encounter the cold-blooded soldiers and lose his life. The doctor had a kind heart indeed. When Anton accidentally tripped and sprained his ankle during their escape, she didn't abandon him, but instead took him to a safe place for careful treatment. Soon, the doctor brought Anton to a village deep in the forest, where some residents still lived, temporarily untouched by the military. However, when the doctor returned from the town, she quickly informed the villagers of the military's massacre of civilians. The scene fell silent, and no one could believe the government would be so ruthless. Just then, they heard a noise outside, showing that the military troops had arrived. Using loudspeakers, they called for the residents to come out and gather, promising to take them to a well-stocked isolation center. But these villagers already knew about the military's treachery and hid in a basement to avoid detection. A soldier was about to open the basement door when he was suddenly distracted by some pig-like snoring. It turned out an old man had fallen asleep and hadn't had time to hide. Seeing that no one else was around, the soldier shot the old man dead, sending him to snore in front of Jesus. After the soldier left, the villagers looked at the old man's body and shivered. The villagers couldn't bear the military's brutal acts, so they decided to seek revenge. One villager, a former Soviet soldier, had stashed a large amount of weapons at home. Although they were old-fashioned, they had been well-maintained and were still useful. The villagers were determined to fight back. Under the guidance of the retired soldier, they became familiar with the weapons. Meanwhile, Anton and some other children gathered in the doctor's house, and she reminded them not to go outside under any circumstances. Then, the villagers set off, planning to head to a bus station where refugees gathered, as it had the most soldiers. In the face of the apocalypse, some people became incredibly greedy while others became weaker, but many others refused to bow to fate. The doctor's group soon arrived at their destination, hiding their weapons under clothes and slowly approaching the unsuspecting soldiers. Just as they were about to make their move, they happened to encounter Sergei and Irina confronting the soldiers. From their conversation, they learned that they were looking for a boy, and the description matched Anton. The doctor couldn't believe the coincidence, but she didn't know that the couple had gone through a lot of hardship to find their lost son. Irina searched through piles of dead bodies, crying in a chicken voice and calling her son's name. She was filled with regret and self-blame for losing her child while helping a stranger. After the unknown virus had swept through the city, the government had quickly abandoned the people, gathering them with false promises and then massacring them in order to avoid further infection. Just a few hours earlier, after treating Pavel's wounds, Irina realized her son Anton was missing. So she immediately turned the car around, heading back to where they had just clashed with the villagers. But her son was nowhere to be found. Irina cried out in desperation, but received no response. Fortunately, Boris noticed Anton's footprints, and they quickly followed them into the forest, and then to the town. Soon, they saw the scattered bodies outside the hospital. Irina rushed into the pile of corpses, her feelings torn. She was afraid to find her son there, but couldn't help searching. Pavel quickly followed, assuring Irina that Anton's body was not there and he must not have been harmed. At that moment, an airplane flew overhead, dropping a large number of leaflets. They urged the refugees to gather at the town's bus station, where the military would escort them to isolation centers. The doctor's group exchanged glances and quickly approached the bus station. Due to the presence of soldiers, they could only use binoculars to carefully search the crowd. That's when Irina spotted a familiar figure boarding a bus. She couldn't care less about the danger and rushed into the station and boarded the bus. Unfortunately, the person she saw wasn't her son, but someone wearing a similar coat. Sergei didn't forget the danger and tried to leave the bus station with Irina. However, they were quickly stopped by a soldier. Sergei pulled out a handgun, quietly aiming it at the soldier's chin. But there were more than one soldier present. In the end, Sergei and his companions were intercepted by the soldiers. Right then, a physical conflict broke out between the soldiers and the villagers who had come for revenge. The situation became chaotic, with the fierce villagers showing no hesitation in killing the soldiers. The outnumbered soldiers were soon all killed. Afterward, the doctor informed Sergei about what happened to Anton. They hurried to the village but couldn't find him in the house where he was hiding. The local children wore cold expressions on their faces. It turned out that they had learned that Anton was from Moscow, and they believed that he had brought disaster to the village. So they had driven him out of the house. Upon hearing this, Irina rushed outside and didn't care about the cold. She continuously shouted Anton's name. Fortunately, she found him in an abandoned house. Unable to hold back any longer, she embraced her son, sobbing. Before leaving, Sergei gave the doctor a few cans of food to express his gratitude. She accepted and warmly bade farewell to Anton before leaving. Meanwhile, Anna, waiting in the car, had a strange feeling. Suddenly, she got out of the car and started coughing violently. Blood appeared on her hand, covering her mouth, a clear symptom of infection. Sergei was faced with a difficult choice. His ex-wife Irina and friend Leonya strongly opposed traveling with an infected patient. Fortunately, they had several vehicles. After some discussion, they decided to let Anna drive one car alone, while Sergei and her son Misha would ride in another car. They then resumed their escape, but Anna's condition worsened, and she could barely hold the steering wheel. Misha noticed a flickering light in the distance, and they quickly carried Anna towards the house. Surprisingly, although the lights were on in the villa, they didn't find any living people inside. Anna was almost unconscious and isolated in a room. Pavel made sure everyone wore masks for safety before searching the villa for medicine. Although they found only some ordinary antibiotics and glucose, it was better than nothing, so they decided to give them to Anna. As Sergei was about to deliver the medicine, Pavel stopped him. It would be better for him to handle the task because he was a doctor. Previously, several doctors who had been in contact with infected patients in the hospital had died, but Pavel was fine. Therefore, he suspected that his body might contain antibodies that could make him immune to the virus. Suddenly, a scream echoed from upstairs. In one of the rooms, Marina discovered several corpses who were the original villa owners. It turned out that the villa had belonged to a military officer and his family, all of whom had been infected by the virus. With no other choice, the officer had to kill his loved ones. Preparing to set fire and be buried with them, the officer suddenly died from the infection. Pavel discovered these bodies, all infected by the virus, and quickly ushered everyone out of the room, locking the door behind them. Upon returning to the living room, everyone was downhearted, worried that staying in the villa might lead to infection. At this moment, Sergei was too preoccupied to care about that, insisting they had to continue searching for medicine. But deep down, he knew that it was nearly impossible to save his wife under these circumstances. The next morning, an exhausted Sergei entered the living room, only to find that Leonya and Irina had divided the area into two sections. Those who had been in close contact with Anna lived on one side, while the remaining people lived on the other. Sergei angrily cursed upon learning this, saying that Anna might just have a common cold, and everything would be clear in 3 days. If they couldn't wait, they should just leave. This put Leonya in a difficult position. He didn't want to abandon his friend, but Marina was restless and wanted to leave. Anna initially had severe coughing and blurred consciousness. However, that night she acted strangely, asking why the lights were off in the well-lit room. Polina was puzzled, so she quickly turned on her flashlight, only to witness Anna's eyes were pale and bloodshot, clear signs of the virus. Everyone knew how dangerous this virus was. Misha, who had been battling depression, felt the impending loss of his mother and didn't want to live anymore. He went to the room where the officer had died, found his gun and aimed it at his chin. Fortunately, Polina appeared in the nick of time, slapping him to the ground and pleading with him not to do that, admitting she had long been in love with him. But Misha rejected the girl he loved. At least, for now, he gave up on the idea of taking his life. Leonya's family was worried about staying in the same house as Anna and becoming infected. Eventually, they decided to leave the villa and head to Vongozero Lake first. They claimed it was to scout the area and prepare a place to stay. This made Sergei even more dejected, turning to alcohol to drown his sorrows. Coincidentally, he encountered his father praying to God. Sergei mocked and ridiculed him, saying no one could help them now. With no other option, he hit the walls in frustration to vent his anger. Irina discovered Sergei, who had passed out drunk by the pool and nearly drowned. Regardless of the risk of infection, she comforted him. As their emotions intensified, they ended up engaging in an intimacy, while poor Anna was still gravely ill and her fate unknown. After learning Anna's blood type, Pavel made a bold attempt. He injected his own blood, containing antibodies, into Anna's body. Somehow, they made it through this absurd and difficult day. The next morning, Misha went to check on his mother and found her lying motionless on the floor outside her room. He seemed to guess what had happened and left with a gloomy expression. But suddenly, his mother's voice called out. Misha turned around in surprise and saw Anna, who had managed to crawl out of the room, her eyes back to normal. They embraced joyfully, and it was evident that Anna had recovered from her infection. Once everyone confirmed Anna's recovery, they breathed a sigh of relief. Sergei was grateful to Pavel, who hadn't expected his desperate attempt to actually work. The group then decided to leave immediately, but they couldn't find Boris. After searching, they finally found him collapsed in the prayer room. Pavel examined him and determined that Boris had suffered a heart attack. After receiving first aid, Boris finally woke up, but it was like a brief resurgence before the end. Upon seeing Anna, he said, "God saved you," and closed his eyes forever. Poor Boris had shown everyone the way to refuge, but fell just before reaching it. The group wrapped his body and decided to bury him at Vongozero Lake, as it was the place he longed for the most. Little did they know that they would soon encounter a new situation. The vehicle carrying Leonya and his family had overturned at the roadside, with bloodstains everywhere but no sign of them. Sergei couldn't help but worry. In the desolate, snowy landscape, Leonya struggled forward, dragging a bright red cloth. The places he passed left a trail of blood, incredibly vivid. The pregnant Marina sat in a daze on the red cloth. She must have suffered a great shock. It turns out that not long ago, Leonya left his virus-infected friend and took his family to Vongozero Lake Refuge. Shortly after setting off, Marina began bleeding. Leonya was overwhelmed. Marina kept calling for him, and in a moment of distraction, their car lost control in the snow and flipped into the nearby woods. The impact caused Marina to miscarry and drove her mad. Afraid to continue along the road, Leonya could only pull Marina through the forest. After a while, Polina could walk no further and collapsed on the ground. Leonya was also near his limit. Fortunately, he spotted a chimney with smoke nearby. Seeing a glimmer of hope, Leonya quickly approached the wooden house and launched a surprise attack on the homeowner. He captured her right there, and Leonya's family finally found a place to stay. They hastily lit a fire to warm up, while the homeowner was locked in the basement. To survive in this chaotic world, Leonya felt he had no choice. But Polina couldn't stand it any longer. She prepared some food and water for the homeowner, warning her father not to treat people like that. Marina had physically recovered, but after suffering a miscarriage, her mental state was unstable. She would hold the baby and play with it one moment, then ramble about how to raise him to be successful the next. Polina didn't dare to speak up, only looking on in horror. Leonya couldn't bear it anymore. While Marina slept, he secretly replaced the baby in her arms with a pillow and then burned the baby's body, hoping to give the poor child some peace. Leonya was also heartbroken but tried not to show it. As the sky brightened, the delirious Marina began searching for her baby. She soon found herself near the basement where the homeowner was held captive. A tempting voice came from inside, saying that the baby is hungry. Without thinking, Marina crawled over. Once the homeowner escaped, she locked up Leonya and his family in the dark basement. At this point, Marina still hadn't realized her predicament and kept calling for her baby. Leonya scolded Marina, saying they both had to bear the loss of their child. Unexpectedly, she dropped a bombshell, saying that she didn't even know who the baby's father was. It turned out Marina was once a dancer who, upon discovering her pregnancy, planned to find a random man to take responsibility. She happened to meet the downcast Leonya at a bar that night. Leonya, unaware of her past, had been loving towards her. Even when his wife lay dying of a terminal illness, he remained devoted. His daughter became rebellious because of this incident. Upon hearing the truth, Leonya let out a cry of despair. At the same time, Sergei and his group had successfully arrived at the lake and were about to find out the truth behind the viral disaster. On the way, they discovered Leonya's vehicle overturned by the roadside. Bloodstains were scattered everywhere, but they couldn't find any trace of their friends. Sergei and Anna decided they couldn't search any longer and needed to continue on their way, considering Leonya and his family had left them behind. However, Misha couldn't stop worrying about Polina and insisted on searching for them alone. Seeing this, Sergei chased after him to stop him, but during the argument, Misha suffered a seizure. Fortunately, Pavel was present, and they carried Misha back to the car and continued towards their destination. The rest of the journey went smoother than expected, and they arrived at Vongozero Lake that day. The lake was located near the Russian border, where few people lived, making it an ideal place to hide from infectious diseases. Misha, who had recovered, seemed a bit down, but there was no other choice. They followed the others towards the small island in the center of the lake, where there was an old ship converted into a wooden house. With ample water sources nearby, they could catch fish and shrimp, so they didn't have to worry about supplies. As they approached the house, Sergei froze, noticing that the lock had been pried open, indicating someone might be living inside. They cautiously entered and searched the house, finding no one but feeling the residual heat in the coal stove. Assuming the occupants had just left, they searched the other rooms, only to find a corpse with both legs sawed off on a wooden board. Pavel suspected it was someone's stored food, sending a chill down Sergei's spine. Just then, the house's occupant returned. Sergei and the others had detected the anomaly early and hid away. Despite the man's cautious vigilance, he was no match for Sergei with a gun in hand and was quickly subdued. Sergei showed mercy and did not kill him, only asking him to pack his things and leave. The man knew that without a permanent home in this icy wilderness, he wouldn't survive long. He couldn't just submit, so while pretending to be pitiful, he secretly pulled out a dagger. But just as he was about to attack, Sergei shot him dead. Sergei didn't intend to be ruthless, but in this chaotic, virus-ravaged world, few could remain unscathed. With the safety threat eliminated, Sergei dug a large pit on the island and buried his father, fulfilling his wish to rest at Vongozero Lake. The long escape journey was finally over, and everyone started their new lives. Irina had once thought Anna was infected with the virus and beyond saving, so she considered reuniting with Sergei. But now, with Anna's miraculous recovery, Sergei was devotedly caring for her, so Irina gave up on the idea of reuniting and instead opened her heart to Pavel, who had always had feelings for her. This situation brought happiness to everyone, and a smile appeared on Irina's face. When Sergei had free time, he took Anton and Misha fishing in the lake. The tranquil ice lake echoed with the cheerful laughter of the boys. Just as everyone's lives seemed to be getting back on track, they were unaware that everything here was like the calm surface of a lake, hiding turbulent undercurrents beneath. Misha had always been upset about his parents abandoning the Leonya family. This even led to a big quarrel with Anna, and he ignored his mother for an entire day. Early the next morning, Irina discovered that their off-road vehicle had disappeared. Sergei didn't take it seriously, thinking it was just stolen. However, they were informed that Misha had gone missing. According to Anna, he hadn't returned since he went out to help Sergei fish. Sergei became even more panicked, as he had finished fishing without seeing any sign of Misha. The group ran to the frozen lake to search, and soon found a broken ice surface. They knew without a doubt that Misha must have fallen through the broken ice into the lake. Anna wailed in pain, while Sergei tried to fish him out with his bare hands. Unsurprisingly, they couldn't even recover Misha's body. Anna fell into immense grief, and Sergei was filled with guilt, regretting asking Misha for help with fishing. Yet Anna, who knew her son well, believed that Misha wouldn't have been so careless. She suspected it was more likely a suicide, as he had been suffering from depression and attempted to terminate himself before. Even knowing this, Anna couldn't help but feel resentful, and she never gave up searching for her son. Finally, there was a new discovery. Sergei eagerly broke through the ice, and underneath they found a corpse. Upon pulling it out, they were relieved to find it was a false alarm. The body wasn't Misha's. Anna walked away without looking back, unsure whether to feel disappointed or relieved. In reality, Misha hadn't died. At that moment, he was driving the off-road vehicle back to where the Leonya family had their accident, because his beloved Polina was there. He couldn't find peace without finding her. Although Misha suffered from depression, he was a very determined person. He had faked his suicide to prevent his parents from looking for him. He began searching at the scene of the accident, following faint traces deeper into the woods. Now, the Leonya family of 3 had been locked in a dark basement for a whole day without water to drink. It was only after Polina pleaded that the old woman who imprisoned them threw down a bottle of water. Getting food, however, wasn't so simple. Leonya, covered in iron chains, had to chop wood in the freezing cold for an entire day to barely earn some food, even if it was moldy and spoiled. This was exactly what the old woman wanted, revealing the depth of her resentment. At night, the long, isolated old woman began to dress up, applying lipstick and wearing a wig, like a rooster in heat. She called Leonya, the only man in the basement, to come upstairs and forced him to lie on the bed, binding his hands with wire. Leonya felt uneasy, especially when he saw her binding his legs as well, realizing that this wasn't a simple bondage game. Seeing the rifle in the old woman's hand, Leonya knew that screaming for help would be futile. As expected, after the old woman had bound Leonya's limbs, she jumped onto him and began to undress herself. Meanwhile, Misha was searching for Polina in the forest. Just as the sky was getting completely dark, he saw a lit cabin not far away. This excited Misha, and memories of his time with Polina flooded his mind. Originally a dull and slow person with depression, Misha became infatuated with Polina, a rebellious and open-minded girl. Their exciting experiences made him feel as if his previous life had been wasted. However, due to the different experiences and opinions of their families before the end of the world, they had to separate. Fortunately, Misha had finally mustered up the courage to abandon everything and pursue his love. He guessed that Polina might be in that cabin, so he recklessly rushed forward. But a trap pierced his flesh, making him cry out in pain. With only his hands, he couldn't break free from the iron trap. He took out the handgun he had brought with him, aimed at the iron chain securing the trap, and pulled the trigger. At the same time, the old woman was startled by the gunshot. Seizing the opportunity, Leonya quickly pulled out his legs and kicked the old woman under the bed. Then he agilely flipped over the iron bed, just dodging a shot fired by the old woman. While she was reloading, he hurled himself at her with a vengeance. Leonya immediately opened the basement door, releasing Marina and his daughter. Marina, now exposed to daylight, regained her senses and repeatedly apologized to her husband. But Leonya had no time for that. After settling Marina and his daughter, he grabbed the gun and went outside. Leonya quickly found Misha lying in the snow and hurriedly dragged him inside. The reunited group had no time for pleasantries, as Leonya began treating Misha's wound. Polina kissed him passionately in front of her parents. Leonya's family was grateful to the courageous young man, especially upon hearing that the shelter at the lake was very habitable. They decided to join his family there. Before leaving, Leonya gave the handcuff key to the old woman in the cellar, having learned to forgive and not seeking revenge for the abuse they suffered. Together, they cleared the snow-covered car, only to find that it wouldn't start. Fortunately, they encountered a kind-hearted monk who was once an auto mechanic. With his help, the car was quickly up and running. As they prepared to leave, Marina implored the monk to baptize their deceased baby. The monk shook his head, explaining that only the living could be baptized and that prayers were the only option for the dead. Leonya decided to hold a formal wedding ceremony with Marina. As long as the monk presided, the wedding would be sacred and blessed. Despite Marina's past treatment of him as a cuckold, Leonya had finally let go after experiencing so much together. They cast aside the past and prepared for a new life. Misha, inspired by their love, couldn't help but pull Polina forward, declaring their intention to marry as well. Under the guidance of the monk, 2 new couples were born. Although the ceremony was simple, it was as radiant as a beacon of hope in the apocalypse. On the other side, Sergei's romantic life wasn't as bright. His current wife, Anna, had always had a poor memory and relied on writing in a diary. Her recent grief had worsened her amnesia, sometimes even causing her to forget the disappearance of her son, Misha. Desperate to remember the most important parts of her life, she wrote in her diary day and night. Sergei went to the kitchen to get her some water, only to witness his ex-wife, Irina, was engaged in an intimate act with Pavel. Sergei was stunned by the smelly scene. Suddenly, an explosion broke the silence nearby. The powerful shockwave knocked him to the ground. Fortunately, he was unharmed and quickly got up, rushing out with Pavel. It turned out that the explosion they had just witnessed was caused by a crashed airplane. Judging by its appearance, it seemed to be a military aircraft from some country. The 2 of them didn't think there would be any survivors, so they headed back to the cabin. Along the way, Pavel decided to go to the bathroom alone, but during this brief moment, an Asian soldier with a sign of viral infection took Pavel hostage. Sergei was surprised that there were survivors from the crashed plane, but he couldn't understand the foreigner's language. Pavel opened a translation app on his phone, claiming he was a doctor and could help. Sergei took advantage of the language barrier, telling Pavel to throw away his phone. They then devised a plan in Russian, with Pavel taking out a scalpel and stabbing the hijacker while Sergei fired his gun. This perfect coordination ended the attacker's life. This was the first time Pavel had killed someone, and he felt terrible. Even when Irina tried to make amends, he silently refused. As Irina prepared to go back to her room to sleep, she picked up a diary which likely belonged to Anna and had been dropped during the explosion. Irina took the diary to her room and read it all night. When she woke up in the morning, she saw Sergei and Pavel leaving, so she immediately followed them. She learned that Pavel had learned to drive and decided to leave for a distant research institute on his own. His blood could potentially cure infectious diseases, but Irina had developed feelings for him and didn't want him to leave. However, Pavel wouldn't abandon the greater good for his own happiness. In the end, he left, leaving Irina heartbroken. When she returned to the cabin, Sergei seemed indifferent. Unable to bear it any longer, Irina lashed out. She had read Anna's diary and knew many of her secrets. It turned out Anna was a manipulative woman who only seduced Sergei because her son Misha needed a father figure. Sergei, a man with a guilty conscience, was the perfect candidate. As a psychologist, Anna was unstoppable when it came to scheming. She could easily cause trouble in Sergei's family, such as planting a condom in his pocket, which would cause Sergei and Irina to fall apart. Sergei was shocked upon hearing all this. Irina continued to expose Anna's darkest moments, even revealing that when Anna was dying from an infectious disease, Sergei was in bed with Irina. Completely stunned, Anna lost the will to resist and could only bear the bitter consequences on her own. She tore up the diary that recorded her past and threw it into the fireplace. In the afternoon, Sergei was acting as if nothing had happened, fishing in the lake with his dog. Suddenly, he spotted several figures approaching in the distance. He raised his gun cautiously, but when they got closer, he recognized Misha and Leonya among them. He quickly ran over and embraced them, unable to hide the joy of their reunion. Just then, they heard the sound of artillery fire in the distance. Looking in that direction, they saw Sergei's cabin engulfed in raging flames, and they raced towards it in panic. Meanwhile, not far away in the nearby woods, a group of foreign soldiers were speaking in a strange language. It seemed as if they had received orders from their superiors, and they hastily withdrew from the area. That concludes the entire drama of Season 1. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.